Jacob was a 28-year-old software developer living in a busy city. He was a dedicated worker, the kind of guy who stayed late at the office to meet deadlines and enjoyed the solitude of a quiet evening at home. Most of his friends from college had settled down, gotten married, or moved away, and while Jacob felt a twinge of envy sometimes, he focused on his career and hobbies, believing that the right person would come into his life when the time was right. That's when he met Emily. They crossed paths at a mutual friend's housewarming party. Emily had a warm smile and an infectious laugh that drew people in. She was a marketing manager at a tech startup, vibrant and ambitious, with a knack for making everyone around her feel like the most important person in the room. Jacob, with his quieter demeanor, was captivated by her energy. They spent most of that evening talking, discovering a shared love for indie music and long hikes. Emily made him feel alive in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. Soon, they started dating. The first few months were perfect. They would explore new restaurants, go on weekend trips to nearby nature reserves, and spend evenings watching old movies on Jacob's couch. It felt easy, like they were building something real and lasting. For the first time in years, Jacob let himself dream about a future with someone. Emily often spoke about her past relationships, saying she had been hurt before but was ready for something serious. Jacob admired her openness and vulnerability. He believed he could be the one who wouldn't let her down. He trusted her completely and gave her his whole heart. After a year of dating, Jacob decided to take the next step and asked Emily to move in with him. She hesitated at first, but eventually agreed, saying it was time for them to see if they were truly compatible in a more serious way. Jacob was overjoyed. He rearranged his apartment to make space for her, turning his spare room into an art studio where she could paint during her free time. He even adopted a cat, Max, because Emily had always wanted a pet. Life seemed to be falling into place. But over time, Jacob noticed subtle changes in Emily. She started coming home later, often explaining it away with extra work at the office or spontaneous happy hours with coworkers. She seemed more distant, less interested in their usual conversations or their shared hobbies. When Jacob asked if everything was all right, she reassured him, telling him not to worry and that work had just become stressful. One night, Jacob found himself scrolling through social media while waiting for Emily to come home. He stumbled across a photo tagged by one of Emily's friends. She was out at a bar, laughing with her colleagues, including a guy he hadn't seen before. The two of them looked close, arms around each other, with smiles that felt too intimate for comfort. A pang of unease settled in Jacob's chest, but he pushed it away, convincing himself that it was just paranoia. However, the signs became harder to ignore. Emily's phone buzzed constantly, and she would step out of the room to answer calls, lowering her voice. When she finally came back, she seemed distracted, as if her mind was somewhere else. She stopped making time for their weekend hikes, claiming she was too tired or had other plans. And the intimacy between them began to wane. Jacob found himself going to bed alone more often, staring at the empty space beside him. One rainy evening, Jacob was tidying up the apartment when he found an unfamiliar jacket draped over the back of a chair. It was too big to be Emily's, and certainly not his own. When he asked Emily about it later that night, she froze for a moment before saying it must belong to a friend from work who had stopped by briefly. Her explanation felt thin, but Jacob swallowed his doubts, not wanting to seem insecure or controlling. He told himself that relationships had ups and downs and that he needed to trust her. A few weeks later, everything came crashing down. Jacob had come home early from work to surprise Emily with dinner. He had been thinking about how to bridge the growing gap between them and hoped a quiet evening together might remind them both of why they had fallen in love. But when he walked into the apartment, he found Emily sitting on the couch with the same guy from the photo, the one she had claimed was just a coworker. Their hands were intertwined, and the look on her face, surprised, guilty, panicked, told him everything he needed to know. Jacob felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. He confronted Emily, his voice trembling with disbelief and hurt. She stumbled over her words, trying to explain that it had been a mistake, that she didn't mean for things to get this far, that she still cared about Jacob. But the excuses only deepened the wound. The other guy, realizing the mess he was in, quickly left, leaving Jacob and Emily alone in a silence that felt like it would swallow them both. Emily confessed that she had developed feelings for her coworker, that their relationship had grown strained, and that she didn't know how to end it without hurting Jacob. But her words rang hollow. In that moment, Jacob realized that the woman he thought he knew, the woman he had trusted with his heart, had betrayed him in a way he never imagined possible. Emily packed her things and moved out that night. Jacob didn't try to stop her. As he watched her leave, he felt an emptiness settle in, as if a piece of his life had been ripped away. He didn't sleep that night, replaying every moment, every conversation, every ignored red flag. How had he not seen this coming? What had he done wrong? These questions haunted him, but the answers seemed just out of reach. The following weeks were a blur. Jacob struggled to get out of bed, to focus on work, to find meaning in the daily routines that had once given him comfort. His friends tried to cheer him up, inviting him out or suggesting new hobbies, but he felt disconnected from everything. The hurt was too raw, the wound too deep. He missed Emily terribly, even though he knew she had betrayed him. It was a paradox he couldn't wrap his head around. How could he still care for someone who had broken his heart? He would sit in the empty apartment, staring at the art studio he had built for her, wondering if she had ever truly loved him. The silence that filled his home was deafening, a constant reminder of what he had lost. And yet, he kept trying to understand what had gone wrong, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he could find some closure. Jacob struggled with the pain of Emily's betrayal. Days turned into weeks, and the memories of their time together continued to haunt him. Every corner of the apartment reminded him of her. The small coffee mugs she'd insisted on buying, the little trinkets they'd collected from their trips, the empty art studio that now felt like a hollow space in his life. He spent a lot of time reflecting on their relationship, replaying moments in his head and questioning every decision. He wondered how he had missed the signs, why he had ignored the growing distance between them. He blamed himself, thinking he hadn't been enough, that if he had been more exciting, more present, maybe things would have been different. It wasn't long before Jacob realized he needed help to deal with the weight of his emotions. He reached out to a therapist, feeling embarrassed at first, but he knew he couldn't carry this burden alone. His therapist, a patient older man named Dr. Miller, listened to Jacob's story with empathy and offered him a safe space to express his grief and confusion. Through their sessions, Jacob began to understand that it wasn't his fault that Emily had made the choices she did. Her actions reflected her own struggles and insecurities, not a failure on his part. Dr. Miller guided Jacob through the painful process of accepting what had happened and encouraged him to focus on himself again. It was far from easy, but Jacob gradually began to see that his life wasn't defined by this one heartbreak. He learned to forgive himself for the times he had overlooked the signs, for trusting too easily, and for holding on to the hope that Emily might change. As winter turned into spring, Jacob decided to take small steps towards rebuilding his life. He deleted old photos of Emily from his phone, packed away the things she had left behind, and even rearranged his apartment to make it feel like his own space again. He joined a local hiking group, rediscovering the joy of being out in nature, surrounded by people who were strangers at first but soon became friends. One afternoon during a hike, Jacob found himself talking to a fellow group member named Sarah. She had been through a difficult breakup a few years earlier and shared her own story of feeling lost and betrayed. They talked about the pain of being cheated on, the sense of worthlessness it left behind, and the long road to self-acceptance. For the first time in months, Jacob felt understood, and in Sarah, he found a kindred spirit who knew exactly what he was going through. Their conversations helped Jacob realize that he wasn't alone in his experience. Many people had faced similar heartbreaks and had managed to find their way back to themselves. He and Sarah became good friends, meeting up outside of the hiking group for coffee or to try new activities around the city. Jacob appreciated having someone who understood his pain, but who also encouraged him to look forward, not backward. Still, healing wasn't a straight line. There were days when the loneliness would creep back in, when he would catch himself thinking about what could have been if things had turned out differently with Emily. But instead of drowning in those thoughts, Jacob began to write them down in a journal, a habit he picked up from therapy. He wrote about the good times, the bad times, and everything in between. It became a way for him to let go of the emotions he couldn't express out loud. One evening, after a long day at work, Jacob found the courage to look through some of the old entries he had written in the weeks following the breakup. He realized how far he had come since those first days of utter despair. He no longer felt like the same person who had been shattered by the discovery of Emily's infidelity. He had learned that healing isn't about forgetting the pain, but about learning to live with it and finding new reasons to smile. A few months later, Jacob received a text from Emily. She said she wanted to meet up, to talk about everything that had happened. For a moment his heart raced, wondering if she wanted to apologize, if there was a part of her that regretted leaving. But then he caught himself. He realized he didn't need that closure from her anymore. He had found his own way to move on, and meeting her would only reopen wounds that had taken so long to heal. He responded with a polite but firm message, letting her know that he had moved on and that he wished her the best. It wasn't a dramatic moment, but it was significant. For the first time, Jacob felt like he had regained control over his life. He was no longer looking back, hoping for answers that might never come. Instead, he was focused on building a future that made him feel whole again. As the months passed, Jacob continued to make progress. He threw himself into work with a renewed energy, got promoted to a senior position, and even started mentoring new employees. He adopted another cat, Luna, to keep Max company, and the two pets filled his home with a sense of warmth that he had thought was lost forever. He reconnected with old friends and made new ones, learning to enjoy life's simple pleasures again. One warm summer evening, Jacob found himself sitting on his balcony, watching the sunset with Sarah by his side. They weren't dating. Jacob wasn't ready for that yet. And Sarah respected his need for time. But they shared a friendship that was built on honesty, and Jacob knew that he could trust her with his thoughts, his fears, and his hopes. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jacob thought about how much he had changed in the past year. He had learned that healing is a messy, painful process, but it's also a chance to grow. He had come to understand that self-worth isn't defined by another person's actions, but by how you choose to respond to the challenges life throws at you. Jacob's story wasn't a fairy tale. It didn't end with him getting back with Emily, nor did he find some magical new love that made everything perfect, but it was real. He learned that life moves on, that people heal, and that it's okay to feel pain as long as you don't let it define you. In the end, Jacob found peace, not in the idea of being with someone, but in knowing that he could stand on his own 2 feet, even after everything had fallen apart. And in that peace, he found hope for whatever might come next. Jacob's story serves as a reminder that heartbreak is a part of life. And while it can leave deep scars, those scars can also become a source of strength. It teaches us that while betrayal can shatter us, it doesn't have to break us completely. There's always a path forward, even if it takes time to find it. And in the process, we discover not just who we are, but who we have the potential to become.